be on the list, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Shanahan alleged that conservatives are bringing forward frivolous ethics complaints. I would remind Ms. Shanahan, through you, Mr. Chair, of the litany of guilty findings by the Ethics Commissioner with respect to key figures in this government. We have the Prime Minister, who was found guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act, not once, but twice. The first Prime Minister in Canadian history to be found guilty of breaking the Conflict of Interest Act. How about the current Minister of Public Safety, Dominic LeBlanc, guilty of contravening the Conflict of Interest Act? And then there's the Trade Minister, Mary Ng, guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act. And remember Bill Morneau, the former finance minister under Justin Trudeau, guilty of violating the Conflict of Interest Act, I think twice in his case. And then there's the Prime Minister's former parliamentary secretary, guilty of contravening the Conflict of Interest Act. What we have, Mr. Chair, is a pattern of conflict and corruption in this government that goes right to the top, right to the Prime Minister.
Serial lawbreakers.
A bunch of serial lawbreakers. Indeed, the Prime Minister, their leader, is probably the biggest lawbreaker amongst them. Now, with respect to the motion that has been put forward by Mr. Barrett, the central question that must be answered is, who's Randy? And where is Randy, by the way? Where is he? In the face, he seems to be in hiding in the face of today's report in the National Post that he fraudulently represented that his company was Indigenous owned to secure millions of dollars of federal contracts. So where is he? It would be nice if he could show his face. But we have an affidavit that was filed on November 5th that we now have a copy of, and contained within the affidavit are a series of exhibits that include new text messages that cast further doubt about the minister's truthfulness when he came before this committee.
Right.
And I think it's important to look at the track record of this minister when it comes to telling the truth and when it comes to being forthcoming. This is a minister who came to this committee in June and was adamant that he wasn't the Randy in the text messages. But of course, the Gowie group believed at all times that the Randy in the text messages was the Minister of Employment. Stephen Anderson was asked by Global News, who is the Randy in the text messages? And he said, well, it's the VP of Logistics. But when Global News looked into who is the VP of Logistics, they found out that it was not a Randy, it was a guy by the name of Edward Anderson, who turns out to be Stephen Anderson's father, Stephen Anderson being the shady business partner of the Minister of Employment. Global News made further inquiries to find a trace of this other Randy. They couldn't. Stephen Anderson came before the committee and said there was only one Randy that was ever connected to global health imports, and that is the Minister of Employment. And not to mention the fact that in the original text messages that were discovered, the Randy is referenced in the context of being a partner. Well, it turns out that the Minister of Employment was a partner with Stephen Anderson up until he was elected in 2021, and at the time of the text messages, the minister had a 50% ownership stake in the company in Global Health Imports. So in the face of all of that, without any trace of another Randy, without any credible explanation of who this other Randy could be, there is really only one conclusion that can be drawn to the question of who's Randy, and that is that Randy is the Minister of Employment, the minister from Edmonton, a Randy who shook down Global Health Imports in a $500,000 wire fraud scheme. A Randy who was a 50% owner, a partner in a company that has been ordered by Alberta courts to pay back clients $7.8 million for ripping them off.
Unbelievable. Wow. Unbelievable.
We have a minister now who is part of a company that has been sued by the Gowie Group for this $500,000 shakedown when when Global Health Imports failed to deliver the PPE that they had ordered pursuant to the contract that they had entered into. And remember when the minister came to committee in June, and one of the things that his office did at the time was issue a statement that said it could not have been the minister because the minister was in Vancouver on September the 8th, 2022, and he was at a cabinet meeting and he didn't have access to his phone, and therefore it was impossible that the Randy in the text messages was the minister. But then, after he appears before the committee the first time, Global News uncovers new text messages. New text messages from September 6, 2022, from between Anderson and the Gowie Group, in which Anderson, as he's shaking them down for the $500,000, says, asking as West Coast is closing in 7 minutes and Randy is in the Vancouver office. Wow. Oops. Wow. Randy is in Vancouver. Well, the minister, turns out, was in Vancouver on September the 6th. And when the minister came back to committee in September with these fresh text messages, fresh insofar as at the time they had just recently been made public, my colleague, Mr. Barrett, put it to him to say, come on, minister, you're obviously that Randy. And the minister was confronted with the text messages, admitted that, yes, he was in Vancouver on September 6th, and then he provided new information that he had withheld from the committee, and that is that he had texted and spoken with Anderson on September the 6th. Wow. Now, when the minister came in June, he would have had committee believe that he had nothing to do with Anderson.
Exactly.
That upon being elected in 2021, other than having a 50% ownership stake, which is a pretty big deal, that he never spoke to this guy. He had nothing to do with the operations of the company. He was totally oblivious to what was going on. And then he comes back, confronted with text messages, placing him in Vancouver at the same time that Anderson is referring to a Randy in Vancouver. He suddenly says, oh, by the way, I spoke with Anderson. That constituted a material omission on the part of the minister. The minister, for all intents and purposes, misrepresented to this committee his dealings with Anderson by his omission.
Exactly.
And so it's part of a pattern of not being forthcoming. It's part of a pattern of a minister who is changing his story as new details emerge. So now that we have these additional text messages that evidence that the minister was not forthcoming and may provide further evidence that the minister was involved in fraud, it will be interesting to see how his story changes when he comes, hopefully, before this committee as soon as possible.
Exactly.
And so we need to hear from this minister. He shouldn't be a minister.
Exactly.
He should have been fired long ago as a minister. He has no place sitting in the cabinet, given his record of frankly not being forthcoming, being implicated in this shady business that is ridden by allegations of fraud, and not just allegations of fraud. There are, I just emphasize again, $7.8 million in judgments by Alberta courts against his company, the company that he had a 50% interest in, stemming from lawsuits from the time that he was a partner in the business. So, Mr. Chair, it's important that we pass Mr. Barrett's motion and haul Minister Boissonnault back to this committee.
Hear, hear.
Okay, thank you.